Kesrath Vane had completed 211 confirmed contracts across a 30-year career as the Krivath Compact's most feared independent operative, and every single target, across every single contract, had died without a single word exchanged between hunter and prey. Target 212 was a human logistics coordinator named Peter Voss, and Kesrath Vane lowered her weapon in his cramped apartment kitchen because he apologized to her, sincerely and without any calculated strategic purpose, for the mess on his kitchen table. The Compact's most sophisticated psychological profiling had classified Kesrath Vane, formally, as functionally incapable of the kind of emotional engagement most sentient species required to maintain sustained interpersonal relationships, a diagnosis that had never once been framed as a deficiency within the specific professional context that had employed her considerable talents for 3 decades. Her clients valued precisely the quality her species' psychological assessment had labeled a disorder, an absolute, unwavering capacity to view any target purely as a technical problem requiring resolution, entirely unclouded by the emotional entanglement that made most operatives, even highly skilled ones, occasionally hesitate at the critical moment. She had never hesitated. Not once, across 211 contracts, had a target's fear, pleading, or desperate final words produced anything beyond the same clinical, professional assessment she brought to every technical aspect of her work. Peter Voss's contract had arrived through her usual channels 11 days before the engagement, flagged as a routine corporate elimination. A mid-level human logistics coordinator, whose access to certain shipping manifests had apparently become inconvenient to a considerably more powerful client, whose specific interests Kesrath Vane, according to the strict professional discipline that had defined her entire career, had never once found reason to question. She had studied his file with her usual thoroughness, tracking his movements across 11 days of surveillance that revealed nothing beyond the unremarkable pattern of an ordinary human life. A modest apartment, a routine commute, evenings spent, according to her considerable observational data, cooking meals he ate alone while reviewing what her surveillance equipment identified as recreational reading material rather than anything professionally significant. Nothing in 11 days of surveillance had suggested any deviation from the straightforward technical execution that had defined every previous contract of her considerable career. She entered his apartment during the specific window her surveillance had identified as optimal, a Tuesday evening when Peter Voss's established routine placed him alone, unarmed, and entirely unprepared for the professional intrusion about to interrupt his evening. She found him in his kitchen, attempting, with the particular focused concentration of someone genuinely engaged in the task rather than performing any elaborate deception, to salvage a meal that had, judging by the smoke still faintly visible near his stove, not proceeded according to plan. He turned, weapon raised in her hand, his expression carrying the immediate, unmistakable shock of a man confronting exactly the kind of threat his life had never previously required him to prepare for. "I'm sorry," he said, and Kesrath Vane's considerable professional experience, honed across 211 previous contracts, initially processed the statement as precisely the kind of desperate, strategically calculated appeal every target eventually attempted. Some variation of pleading intended to produce hesitation or sympathy her professional discipline had always, without exception, proven entirely immune to. "I mean," he continued, and something in his specific tone genuinely, almost absurdly apologetic rather than desperate or pleading, produced in Kesrath Vane a specific, entirely unprecedented moment of professional uncertainty. "I don't really know what you're here for, and I assume it's probably not great for me, whatever it is, but I've got to say, I'm genuinely sorry about the mess. I was trying a new recipe, and it did not go well, and if you're about to, do whatever it is you're here to do, I really wish it wasn't happening in the middle of what looks like a kitchen disaster. Seems like a pretty undignified place for whatever's about to happen." Kesrath Vane did not lower her weapon immediately. 211 contracts had taught her considerable professional caution regarding any target's unexpected behavior, a caution that had, across her entire career, never once required genuine reconsideration of an engagement's fundamental parameters. What her considerable professional experience had genuinely never previously encountered was a target whose final words, in the specific moment her weapon indicated imminent lethal engagement, addressed not his own impending death, not any strategic appeal for mercy or negotiation, but a specific, sincere apology regarding the aesthetic state of his kitchen at the moment of his execution. "You are apologizing," she said, her weapon remaining raised but her voice carrying a specific, unfamiliar quality that her own considerable professional training had never previously produced during an active engagement, "for the condition of your kitchen, in the moment immediately preceding your death." "I mean, yeah," Peter said, his own voice carrying genuine, ongoing distress that Kesrath Vane's considerable prior experience recognized as authentic fear, entirely consistent with a man genuinely confronting his own imminent death. "I guess it does sound kind of ridiculous when you say it back to me like that. I don't really know why that's the thing my brain decided to focus on. Maybe because it's the only part of this whole situation I actually have any control over, and everything else about what's happening right now is completely out of my hands. I don't know. I'm not trying to manipulate you or anything, if that's what you're thinking. I genuinely don't know what to say to someone who's here to kill me. I've never had to figure that out before. So I guess my brain just landed on the one thing I actually know how to apologize for properly." Kesrath Vane spent, according to her own subsequent professional debrief documentation, considerably longer than any previous contract's execution window standing in Peter Voss's kitchen, her weapon still raised, processing a psychological experience her considerable 30-year career had genuinely never previously required her to navigate. "I want to understand something," she said finally, her weapon lowering incrementally, in a manner that surprised her own considerable professional discipline as thoroughly as it apparently surprised the target still standing before her. 211 previous contracts, every single one without exception, produced some variation of pleading, negotiation, or desperate strategic appeal, calculated consciously or unconsciously toward achieving survival. You have offered none of that. You have offered instead an apology regarding your kitchen's aesthetic condition. I do not understand the strategic purpose of this approach." "There isn't one," Peter said, his voice carrying genuine, considerable confusion regarding a question he clearly had not anticipated being asked by the person apparently there to kill him. "I'm not trying to be strategic. I don't think I'm smart enough in this specific moment to be strategic about anything. I'm just being honest, I guess, because I don't really know what else there is to do. I'm scared. I don't want to die. But I also don't think pretending or begging or trying to talk you out of whatever you're actually here to do is going to change anything if you've already decided to do it. So I guess I just decided to be exactly who I actually am, in whatever time I've got left, instead of trying to become somebody more convincing. Turns out who I actually am is somebody who's genuinely embarrassed about his kitchen, even now. I don't know what that says about me. Probably nothing good." Kesrath Vane's weapon lowered completely, a professional decision that her subsequent formal debrief documentation would struggle, across considerable extended analysis, to adequately justify within any of the strategic or tactical frameworks that had governed every previous engagement of her considerable career. "I have killed 211 people," she said, a statement she would later note in her own private reflection on the engagement, represented the first time in 30 years she had spoken that specific number aloud to anyone, including herself. Every one of them attempted, in their final moments, to become someone other than who they actually were, someone more sympathetic, more strategically compelling, someone they calculated might produce hesitation in me. None of them succeeded, because I have never once been susceptible to strategic manipulation, regardless of its sophistication. You have not attempted manipulation. You have simply continued being exactly who you were before I arrived, a man embarrassed about his kitchen, apparently incapable of performing anything else even while confronting his own death. I do not fully understand why this has produced hesitation in me, when 211 considerably more sophisticated appeals never once did. Maybe because it's not actually an appeal, Peter said, his own considerable fear still evident but tempered by that point, with something that might have been genuine curiosity regarding the strange, unprecedented conversation unfolding in his kitchen. Everybody else, all those other people you're talking about, they were trying to convince you they deserve to live right, trying to make a case one way or another. I don't think I'm doing that. I think I'm just being here. Being scared and embarrassed and honest about both those things, without trying to turn any of it into an argument for why you should let me go. Maybe that's actually harder to defend against, in whatever way you're used to defending against things, because there's nothing actually being aimed at you. I'm not trying to hit some target in your head that makes you hesitate. I'm just standing here, being a person, and I guess that's just naturally kind of hard to shoot. Kesrath Vane did not complete the contract. Her formal report to her considerable, extensive professional network, filed with a directness that would eventually generate genuine alarm among clients who had relied for 30 years on her absolute professional reliability, contained an explanation that would become, within the specific, secretive circles that tracked such matters, one of the most extensively discussed anomalies in the entire history of compact contract enforcement. I am terminating my professional engagement with this contract, effective immediately, she wrote, in a communication that represented the first formal contract termination of her considerable 30-year career. I do not offer a strategic justification for this decision, because I do not possess one that would satisfy the professional standards this network has always required of my work. I encountered, during this engagement, a target who did not attempt to become anything other than exactly who he already was, a specific, genuine authenticity I have never previously encountered across 211 prior engagements, and that authenticity produced in me a psychological response I do not currently have adequate professional framework to properly explain. I am aware this decision represents a significant departure from 30 years of unbroken professional reliability. I do not currently possess sufficient clarity regarding my own psychological state to guarantee this represents an isolated incident rather than a broader shift in my professional capacity. I recommend this network consider my future availability accordingly. Peter Voss survived the engagement, relocated under a considerably enhanced security protocol that his employer, upon learning of the failed contract, arranged with genuine urgency, and would spend the following years attempting, with limited success, to properly process and experience his own ordinary life had never previously required him to develop adequate psychological framework for understanding. Kesrath Vane, whose subsequent professional trajectory would take her considerably away from the specific work that had defined the first 30 years of her considerable career, offered, years later, through channels that would eventually allow the two individuals whose brief, strange encounter had fundamentally altered both their lives to exchange limited, careful correspondence, a reflection that Peter Voss would eventually describe, in his own private journaling about the experience, as the thing that finally allowed him to understand what had actually happened in his kitchen that Tuesday evening. I spent 30 years believing my professional success depended on remaining entirely immune to whatever a target attempted to make me feel, she wrote. I now believe I was correct about my immunity to manipulation, but fundamentally wrong about what that immunity actually protected me from. I was never vulnerable to strategic appeals, calculated pleading, or sophisticated psychological manipulation, and 211 contracts confirmed that immunity repeatedly, without exception. What I discovered, standing in your kitchen, was that I had never developed any comparable immunity to simple, unguarded human authenticity, because no target, across 211 prior engagements, had ever offered it to me. Every one of them, understandably, given their circumstances, tried to become something more strategically compelling than themselves. You simply remained exactly who you were, afraid and embarrassed and entirely without strategic calculation. And I discovered, in that specific moment, that this represented something my considerable professional training had never once prepared me to encounter, let alone resist. I do not believe I am equipped to properly explain why authentic human vulnerability succeeded where calculated appeal never once did. I believe, perhaps, it is simply because manipulation is a technical problem, and I was very good for 30 years at solving technical problems. Authenticity is not a technical problem. I do not believe it was ever meant to be solved at all.